Welcome back. I'm very pleased to say we're joined once again by Seth Cropsey, the former Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy in the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations. He is also a senior fellow and the director of the Center for American Sea Power at the Hudson Institute here in Washington, D.C. Seth is the author of Mayday, The Decline of American Naval Supremacy, and always a welcome guest here. Seth, good to have you with us again. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Frank.
I'm interested, first and foremost, Seth, to get your sort of strategic and military analysis or assessment of what China is up to in the Western Pacific. They seem to be at breakneck speed manufacturing islands out of various atolls and croppings of rock and turning them into deep water ports and airfields and the like. How does this fit into their overall purpose, as you see it, and our strategic interests in that part of the world?
It fits into their overall purpose by establishing what China has long maintained is its territorial claim, its claim of sovereignty over what's called the 9-dash or 11-dash line, which is a tongue, shaped like a tongue, that stretches into the South China Sea about 1,000 miles from China. And their argument is that they're entitled to that because they're the great power in the area and historic reasons and a lot of hooey. So these little islands that they're making out of reef outcroppings, shoals, atolls, as you pointed out, are another in a series of steps, including, for example, the establishment of identification zones for aircraft in the area that try to establish by law or by custom or tradition their claim to the area.
What the senior commander in the region for the United States military, Admiral Harry Harris, has said at the Aspen Security Forum recently is that this looks to him like, quote, aggressive, coercive island building, unquote. How does this fit into specifically China's agenda vis-a-vis nations in the region like the Philippines and like Vietnam? Does this mean that we're likely to see it behaving still more aggressively and possibly coming to blows with them, Seth Cropsey?
Well, that's a very good chance, and Admiral Harris is correct, absolutely correct. The object here is, there are several objects here. The islands that are disputed, whose ownership is disputed between China and Taiwan and the Philippines and Vietnam and Japan and Malaysia, are all they're all significant points in China's effort to establish hegemony in the region, make clear that they're the first power, cow the neighbors, especially those with whom they have disputes, which is to say just about everybody, and establish itself as the major power in Asia, and that runs counter to our interests.
You have written at the Hudson Institute about the islands that we have been relying upon. I believe this appeared in The Hill earlier this month, that including the Northern Marianas, that are critical to our ability to project power in the region. How do these various islands and the sort of geography of this incredibly strategically important area of the world, these waters are rich with resources on the one hand, and they're transited by most of the world's commerce, certainly energy flows. Seth, if you had to net this out, is the advantage accruing now to the Chinese, or are we holding our own, or where are the trends taking us?
Well, the trend is definitely in favor of China. For right now, we're holding our own. The problem is that China is building its navy, and we are diminishing ours, very simply. And the resources are becoming, the money to buy ships and aircraft and the platforms that are needed in order to maintain our position as the world's great naval power are decreasing, while China is going in the opposite direction. They're increasing. So right now we're fine, we're okay. If the trend lines continue as they exist today in the same direction and at the same pace, we'll be in trouble in 20 years.
Our guest is Seth Cropsey of the Hudson Institute, formerly a Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy under George Herbert Walker Bush and President Reagan. In your book, Mayday, Seth, you've talked about the concerns you have, and I think we all should, about one other aspect of these trends, which is really the ability to sustain the numbers of ships we need to have presence, to have deterrent capabilities in far-flung places of the world like the South China Sea. In an earlier conversation, I spoke previously in this program with Mark Helprin, but in an earlier conversation he said something to me that had me completely agog, and that is that the Chinese, he says, have now got something on the order of 100 shipyards capable of producing naval combatants. I'm not quite sure what we're down to, but I'd be surprised if it's more than 4 or 5. That plus the budgets available for shipbuilding would make the trends you've just described very worrisome indeed. Talk a bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, well, that's a serious problem, not only for us, not only because it reduces our ability to build more ships if an administration comes along and says, well, we want a naval rearmament program. We could do that, but it's going to be slow. But the other thing to think about, Frank, is that if we find ourselves in a shooting war somewhere or other in the world, or 2 of them, and we have the misfortune to have a ship that is damaged, either slightly or severely, those same shipyards are the ones that are going to have to repair it. And it's very difficult to build ships and repair them at the same time if you only have a couple of places to build large ships.
Seth, the Chinese seem to have established themselves on both ends of the Panama Canal, and if you need ships from one ocean to fight the war in the other, this could be a considerable problem if the enemy turns out to be the people who have innocuously built these so-called container ports to manage their commercial interests in a very strategic place.
That's a large issue. Those shipyards that Mark Helprin was talking about, their main function is not to build combatants. Their main function is to turn out cargo ships, merchant ships.
But I gather the Chinese are now adapting some of those to enable them to be, militarized on short notice if they choose to. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, but they're not going to be armored.
But if they're armed, it may be a problem enough, especially if they're in large numbers. And, Seth, one of the things that I'm struck by, and we have to wrap it up, I'm afraid, but just to leave us with a parting thought, the Chinese military is making noises to the effect that they think what's been happening in their stock market lately is a function of a U.S. economic war against them. I see no evidence of that, but I do worry that we may find ourselves confronting China for its own reasons that is going to behave even more aggressively, not just towards our allies in the region, but towards us as well. Seth, I hope you'll come back to us. There's so much more to talk about. This is a topic we've only just scratched the surface, but your work at the Hudson Institute on these issues, including more generally the naval capabilities and requirements of the United States, is really deeply appreciated, as is your service, of course, in government. Keep it up and come back to us again very soon if you would.
Thank you, Frank. It's always a pleasure.
Next up, Jim Hansen joins us. We'll talk about the Kurds, what's happening with Turkey and them and us straight ahead.